the White House series celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence. And a big shout out to President Trump and his White House for making this series. Haven't these videos been great? And of course, a lot of you know the names, Stephen Chung and Caroline Leavitt, two great patriots. But I want to shout out the entire team over there. Some of these folks I've worked with over the years, some of them I consider friends. Pat Adams, Kaylin Dorr, Sonny Nelson, Kush Desai, Anna Kelly, Allison Schuster, so many great people over there. And I just want to shout them out. What a great job you did with this video series. So join us tonight for a special celebration of America as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of our independence. We hope you'll enjoy tonight's special program.
In order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
It's commonly said about George Washington that he was the indispensable American. But there's ample evidence that John Adams may indeed be an indispensable American too. Though never a soldier, Adams fought for America's freedom in our nation's most important chapter. Few Americans in history have a political and diplomatic resume like Adams. Here's a list of some of the positions he held in public life. Massachusetts delegate to the Continental Congress. First U.S. minister to the Netherlands and Great Britain. America's first vice president and our second president, among many other prominent positions. Adams also authored several influential works on government, including, most notably, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which he wrote alone, and which is, to this day, the oldest written constitution in the world. It served as a model for the U.S. Constitution, specifically its focus on separation of powers among and between the branches of government. But there's much more to Adams' life than his resume, including real accomplishments and crucial battles fought and won for his country. Though Adams was impatient and viewed as too tactless for legislative life, he was a ferocious behind-the-scenes operator and ended up playing a big part in the most momentous decisions in our nation's fight for independence and beyond. His decision to nominate George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the colonial armies was as consequential an act as any he would perform. Adams first met Washington while the two served as delegates to the First Continental Congress. He was impressed with Washington's military experience and Washington's demeanor, and knew that to unify the colonies, he would need to choose someone to lead the Continental Army that was not a Yankee. Virginia was not just the richest colony, but the largest, and as David McCullough noted in his biography of Adams, quote, "The very proud Virginians felt they had a right to lead." In the Second Continental Congress, no delegate fought harder than Adams behind closed doors and on the House floor for the colonies to not merely sever ties with Great Britain, but declare independence outright. In May of 1776, it was Adams who called for the formal resolution for independence, and it was Adams who organized the committee charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence. Adams chose Thomas Jefferson, 33 years old at the time, and the youngest delegate for the task. He recognized Jefferson's ability to make words work above and beyond the call of common prose for what was to be the most important writing assignment in world history. After Adams and 55 others put their name to paper and pledged to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, Adams penned these words to his bride Abigail about how that day should be remembered. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. Any one of these accomplishments would have been enough for anyone's lifetime. But there were more. Adams played a pivotal role in the fight for independence on the diplomatic field, securing critical funding from the government of France and negotiating a loan from Dutch bankers of nearly $2 million. It was funding needed on the home front for provisions, arms, and munitions necessary to secure military victory in America and independence thereafter. Adams wrote of his efforts later in his life, "If this had been the only action of my life, it would have been well spent." And there were his efforts, along with John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, on the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. The Treaty of Paris established the United States as an independent nation and doubled the size of America. Lest we forget, Adams served as the second president of the United States and managed to keep the nation out of war. No small task, given the events in France, which was experiencing a revolution of its own. Despite blistering attacks from his own party, particularly from Alexander Hamilton, Adams sent a peace commission to France with hopes of averting war. He succeeded, but at great personal cost. So what do we need to know about Adams to best understand the man? It's first important to understand where he was born and to whom. Adams was not born to wealth. His father made his living as a farmer and shoemaker in the quiet village of 2,000 people called Braintree, Massachusetts. Baptized in the church where his father served as a deacon, Adams learned from him the necessity and importance of hard work, good habits, and trustworthiness. Adams wrote these words about his father after he died: "A man of strict piety and great integrity, much esteemed and beloved wherever he was known, which was not far, his sphere of life being not extensive." The sphere of John Adams' life would extend far beyond Braintree to the great cities of America and Europe too. The turning point in Adams' life came in the form of a scholarship to Harvard at the age of 15. While there, Adams cultivated his appetite for reading, which lasted a lifetime. But it was his time debating that he discovered he'd make a better lawyer than preacher, much to his father's disappointment. After graduating in 1755, he pursued a legal career. Harvard Law wouldn't open its doors until 1817, so Adams did what aspiring lawyers did back then. He worked by day as a teacher to pay for his legal training with lawyers in and around Boston, launching his professional career in 1758. By 1770, he was one of the busiest lawyers in town. Then came the moment that tested Adams' commitment to the rule of law and provided posterity with a window into the character and courage of the man. At great risk to his practice, he chose to represent the Redcoats in the biggest case of his time, the Boston Massacre trial. Adams' rhetorical skills were on full display as he described how the mob pelted the British soldiers with every species of rubbish. One soldier, he said, was beaten to the ground with a club, rising up only to be beaten down again. Do you expect he should behave like a Stoic philosopher, lost in apathy? Adams asked the jurors, and by proxy, the entire city of Boston. Adams then explained to the jurors that the presumption of innocence is the bedrock of any civil society. Better that many guilty persons escape unpunished than one innocent person should be punished. Adams closed his case quoting Algernon Sidney, the English political theorist who wrote Discourses Concerning Government, a textbook that profoundly influenced our founding fathers. The law no passion can disturb. 'Tis void of desire and fear, lust and anger. It does not enjoin that which pleases a weak, frail man, but without any regard to persons commands that which is good and punishes evil in all, whether rich or poor, high or low. 'Tis deaf, inexorable, inflexible. The jury was out less than 3 hours. 6 soldiers were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. Adams suffered in the short term, losing half his law practice. But as time passed, his defense of the Redcoats enhanced his public standing. Years later, Adams concluded that this effort of his was one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. It was a trial that taught us all that unpopular people, or people we hate, and hate for good reason, must not be subject to the whims of the mob, or prosecutors doing the mob's bidding. That single story, more than any other, embodied the nature and character of Adams, and the country he would soon help to birth. The American Republic, after all, is built to protect the rights of Americans through law, not the mere opinions of man. In poor health in the summer of 1826, Adams, 90 years old at the time, was visited by some local leaders seeking a toast they could share for America's upcoming 50th birthday celebration. "I will give you independence forever." Asked if he would add to the toast, Adams replied, "Not a word." Adams died on July 4th, 1826, not long after Jefferson, who died remarkably on the very same day, just hours earlier. His last words before dying, "Jefferson lives." In a letter to Abigail written decades earlier on a matter concerning the raising of their children, Adams wrote, "Fire them with ambition to be useful." At great personal risk to his family, health, and wealth, Adams served his country like few others have before or after. What more could Adams have done to earn the honorific indispensable American? It's a question worth asking and answering as we approach our nation's 250th birthday celebration.
We the people, in order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
Within the cold, cavernous halls of Westminster Palace, the air is stiff with formality, and the marble floors echo under the measured footfalls of Sir Francis Molyneux. Sir Francis, the 7th of the Molyneux baronets, and a man of noble blood and loyal service, strides purposely across the legislative chambers. He's the gentleman usher of the Black Rod, the ceremonial voice of the crown in Parliament. Upon his shoulder rests a simple yet potent symbol of the sovereign, a slender ebony baton tipped in gold at both ends. For centuries, the usher of the Black Rod has summoned members of the House of Commons to attend to the sovereign in the House of Lords. The year is 1776. The day is October 31st. King George III prepares to address Parliament. Sir Francis approaches the heavy oak doors of the House of Commons when suddenly they slam shut. This is no accident. This symbolic gesture echoes a decades-old precedent, symbolizing the House of Commons' independence from the monarchy. Its exact origins date to the 1640s, when King Charles I's attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament ignited the English Civil War and cost the king his head. Unfazed, the Usher of the Black Rod raises his staff and knocks thrice. With that, the doors swing open and all members rise. The summons is delivered. Mr. Speaker, the King commands this honorable House to attend His Majesty immediately in the House of Lords. At the head of the upper chamber, cloaked in ermine and surrounded by bishops and barons, sits King George III, full-faced, regal, and blankly inscrutable. Just hours earlier, the king had arrived in his grand gold state coach drawn by 8 horses and festooned with gilded carvings. Lions to signify national strength, cherubs to signify divine right, and 4 gleaming figures of Triton, the Greek sea god, to proclaim Britain's naval supremacy. The monarchy's power was often memorialized in symbols, and yet, beneath the pomp and circumstance, the edifice of imperial majesty crumbled. The late British Empire, overextended and over-centralized, suffered under the pressures of factionalism and fiscal ruin. The national debt had nearly doubled by 1763, and interest payments alone devoured over half of the annual budget. Britain's incoherent colonial policies, the sugar interest battling the tea interest, Parliament in the hands of the squirearchy, had degenerated into a bureaucratic charade. No symbol of power could plug the cracks forming in its gilded veneer. Had Westminster governed with more prudence, perhaps 13 colonies across the Atlantic may not have severed all political ties with the crown just months earlier, invoking the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as 56 signers penned their names on the Declaration of Independence. To the king, the colonists were simply deluded by an overly zealous and ill-mannered class of leaders who had openly renounced all allegiance to the crown and all political connection with this country. Yet for decades, the colonists had endured repeated violations of what jurist William Blackstone called the absolute rights of every Englishman. The rights of British subjects, established over centuries of English constitutional history, found their earliest expressions in 1215 with the adoption of Magna Carta. This lineage of liberties had been reinforced in the Petition of Rights in 1628 and the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The colonists, as proud Englishmen, were humbly requesting the same protections that they and their forebears had once enjoyed. Instead, for more than a decade, they endured a litany of humiliations and betrayals. Taxes imposed without representation, trade restricted by decree, soldiers quartered in civilian homes, and representative assemblies dissolved by royal order. What began as a dispute over a 3 pence per pound tax on tea had matured into a fundamental contest over the nature of political authority. Whereas the British monarchy asserted divine right and hereditary power, the colonists cast their lot with a radical new creed. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Still, there is a sentence, one sentence, that is echoed across continents and endured through centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That sentence did not simply declare American independence, it declared a revolution in human thought. At a time when birth alone often determined the extent of one's achievement, this sentence shattered assumptions that for too long had governed the old world. It declared that truth exists, that it is knowable, and that man, by virtue of being human, is endowed with inalienable rights. It declared that liberty is not dispensed at the mercy of the state, rather, it is given by God. The English Civil War of the 1640s had already tested the limits of royal power, culminating in parliamentary independence. Now, over a century hence, the symbolic scenes at Westminster, the knocking of Black Rod, the slamming of the Commons' doors, the King's florid address, were the mere remnants of a once mighty empire. The very ritual of barring Black Rod, once an assertion of defiance, echoed hollowly. Across the Atlantic, a much deeper form of defiance had taken root. The Declaration is a promise. More than that, it is a compass, pointing always toward the dignity of the human soul and the solemn duty of free citizens to guard against the rise of tyranny no matter what title it claims. Senates after senates, Thomas Jefferson distilled centuries of political thought into one audacious proposition: that government is not the master of man, but his servant. Among those in Parliament who grasped the gravity of this development was the eloquent orator, Sir Edmund Burke. Just 1 year prior to the colony's Declaration of Independence, Burke, who had long sympathized with the colonists, issued the following warning before Parliament: "A love of freedom is the predominating feature which marks and distinguishes the whole of the Americans. But that love," he added, "rendered them suspicious, restive, and untractable whenever they see the least attempt to wrest from them by force their liberty." Burke understood that the American attachment to freedom was the only advantage worth living for, and he warned that attempts to forcibly suppress this yearning would only deepen the conflict. Upon learning of the Declaration of Independence, Burke was sick at heart, convinced that the moment for reconciliation had passed, and that the empire's map and its future would be irrevocably altered. In the American insurrectionists, King George faced an existential challenge to the very institution of his kingship and the empire over which he reigned. Upon his ascension to the throne in 1760 at the young age of 22, the king famously proclaimed, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." The colonies were part of that glory, extensions of himself as king, but by 1776, that identity was being reshaped by forces greater than him. 1 year prior to the signing of the Declaration, it was already becoming clear that the old world was giving way to the new. And so, standing before the House of Lords in October 1775, the king had declared, "The rebellious war now levied is manifestly carried on for the purpose of establishing an independent empire, and the object is too important, the spirit of the British nation too high, the resources with which God hath blessed her too numerous to give up so many colonies." In carefully measured but resolute words, King George warned Parliament of the dangers this rebellion posed, not only to the loyal colonies, but to the entire European colonial system. He called for unanimity at home, promising to uphold British honor and restore order. British rule had undoubtedly grown increasingly arrogant and unaccountable, driving the colonists to embrace the only option left at their disposal: independence. The colonists had tried to seek peace. In the summer of 1775, the Continental Congress drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a humble appeal to King George III, pleading for his intervention to secure the proper rights of his colonial subjects. The petition, largely the work of political moderate John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, addressed the king with reverence, blaming ministers in London rather than the monarch himself for the escalating tensions. But the petition arrived too late. When the colonial envoys presented the petition to Lord Dartmouth, the king's secretary for the colonies, they were met with silence. His Majesty refused to receive the petition personally or grant any reply. In fact, On October 23rd, days before the petition arrived, King George issued a proclamation branding the colonists as traitors, engaged in open rebellion, commanding all officers to exert their utmost endeavors to suppress such rebellion. The king's decision was final. No compromise, no negotiation, only the suppression of American unrest. And so we return to Westminster in the fall of 1776, where King George issues a call to arms. If their treason be suffered to take root, much mischief must grow from it, to the safety of my loyal colonies, to the commerce of my kingdoms, and indeed to the present system of all Europe. The king's implausible claim to British happiness rang hollow against the colonists' cry for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By the time Parliament rose, a new world had already sprung. The echo of Black Rod's staff sounded the first notes of that radical transformation. But the real knocking, one that would echo through the ages, was issued not from a Black Rod, but from a bold declaration nailed to the conscience of mankind. When the colonists slammed their own metaphorical doors on the British crown, they did so not as traitors, but as rightful heirs to Magna Carta, to habeas corpus, and to Parliament's own sacred independence. By the time the king stood before Parliament, the revolution was underway, not just on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of men.
In order to form a more perfect union.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
The American colonies stood at the brink of revolution. On land, our founding fathers had already established a Continental Army and entrusted its command to General George Washington. But they soon came to a sobering realization. Their war for independence could not be won by land alone. Several delegates of the Continental Congress understood that control of the seas was critical to breaking free from the grip of British tyranny. But not all delegates agreed. On October 3, 1775, when the Rhode Island delegation proposed the creation of a naval force supported by all 13 colonies, Maryland delegate Samuel Chase called it the maddest idea in the world. The objections were rooted in pragmatism, cost, lack of capacity, and fear of the far superior British Royal Navy, proven by their 200-year victory spree over the waves. The assured retribution from the tyrant King George fueled congressional trepidation. With Washington's support, the Continental Congress chose resolve over fear. On October 13, 1775, it was authorized the outfitting of 2 armed vessels to intercept British supply ships for much-needed gunpowder, weapons, and other critical materials. From that authorization, the United States Navy was born. Not from vast resources or naval supremacy, but from the bold determination of a young nation fighting for freedom. They knew that the new republic could not defend its shores by the strength of an army alone. On November 5th, Essex Hopkins was selected as Commander-in-Chief and the first commissioned officer in the United States Navy. On November 25th, Congress authorized Continental Navy vessels to attack any British warship or transport. On November 28th, the Second Continental Congress released Rules and Regulations for the Navy of the United Colonies, drafted by John Adams. On December 3rd, the colonies converted a purchased merchant ship to a 24-gun frigate. That ship would be renamed the Alfred and became the first ship commissioned in the Continental Navy with the flag raised by Lieutenant John Paul Jones. And on December 11th, Congress authorized the construction of 13 frigates to be built in 7 different ports in the colonies. Despite these efforts to jumpstart a naval force, it was a slow beginning. One cannot build a navy overnight. With little to no existing infrastructure or experience in building warships, there are extensive delays and massive cost overruns. To get as many ships in the water in the fastest time possible, the colonies turned to the practice of privateering. Privateering refers to a force of privately owned and operated ships armed and commissioned by government to attack enemy merchant shipping during wartime. Whatever spoils captured, ships, cargo, weapons, food, would be sold back to the government with a certain percentage of the revenue going back to the privateers. It would prove very lucrative to the privateers, and it would prove very helpful to the colonies. By the end of the war, privateers commandeered about 600 British merchant ships, with much of the spoils directed to the war effort. By 1776, our Navy was proving consequential. On March 3rd, a 6-ship American naval force, along with 200 Marines from the recently established Continental Marine Corps, raided New Providence and the Bahamas. Famously known as the Raid on Nassau, it was our Navy Marine Corps team's first successful amphibious assault, capturing Fort Montague and much-needed military supplies, 85 cannons, 15 mortars, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. On April 7th, the converted 16-gun brigantine Lexington, under Captain John Barry, the first captain placed in command of an American warship, commissioned for service under the Continental flag, defeated the HMS Edward, the first British warship captured by the Continental Navy. On October 11th, an American naval force under General Benedict Arnold engaged a much superior force in the Battle of Valcour Island on Lake Champlain in what is generally regarded as one of the first naval battles of the American Revolutionary War, and one of the first fought by the Continental Navy. Though an overall defeat, the American defense of Lake Champlain stalled British plans to reach the upper Hudson River Valley and delayed the British invasion of New York by a year. More importantly, it allowed the Continental Army time to gather the forces necessary to defeat the British at the Battle of Saratoga in October of 1777, in what is considered the turning point of the American Revolutionary War. While the loss had tremendous impact on the British, it was altogether more important for the colonies. Victory had convinced France to lend their navy to our cause, which at the time was one of the most formidable naval powers in the world. The Franco-American alliance was ratified by Congress on June 6, 1778. With the French entry into the war, General Washington quickly recognized that the French Navy would be critical to victory. Britain's ability to move large forces by sea had resulted in the capture of New York City in 1776 and Philadelphia in 1777. As Washington would later say in 1780, in any operation and under all circumstances, a decisive naval superiority is to be considered as a fundamental principle and the basis upon which every hope of success must ultimately depend. His words were prophetic. On September 5th, 1781, 24 French ships under the command of Comte de Grasse faced off against 19 British ships under the command of Sir Thomas Graves, near the mouth of the Chesapeake River, in what is known as the Battle of the Virginia Capes. French naval forces defeated the British fleet in an hours-long naval battle, leaving the French in control of the Chesapeake and trapping 8,500 troops under British General Cornwallis at Yorktown. It was one that sealed the outcome of the war. Because of the effective French blockade, General Cornwallis was unable to be resupplied or extracted by sea by the British Navy. The British would soon be surrounded by land as well as with a combined American and French army traveling from New York. It was a coordinated land-Navy action that Washington had been trying to execute since 1778. It was one that convinced Cornwallis to surrender at Yorktown and convinced much of the British population and Parliament that the war could not be won. On September 3rd, 1783, the British signed the Treaty of Paris and officially surrendered, formally recognizing the United States as a free, sovereign, and independent nation. But independence came with a price. The war left our young republic deeply in debt, and in the aftermath of the war, what remained of the Continental Navy was sold off. The last ship sold was the frigate Alliance in the summer of 1785. There was also a growing sentiment that whatever the money the colonies did have should not be spent on sustaining a navy. That sentiment did not last. They would quickly learn that the only thing more expensive than having a navy is not having one. With their newfound independence came new challenges. American merchants no longer sailed under the protection of British warships, and our commerce quickly became vulnerable on the world's seas. Nowhere was this threat more evident than the Mediterranean, where the Barbary pirates of North Africa preyed on American shipping, seizing cargo and enslaving hundreds of our sailors. Without an American Navy, we were defenseless. Action needed to be taken. After years of paying costly tribute, President Washington and Congress passed the Naval Act of 1794, authorizing the construction of the Navy's 6 frigates: the USS United States, USS Constellation, USS Constitution, USS Chesapeake, USS Congress, and USS President. This act marked the rebirth of the United States Navy, and these ships would play a significant role in securing victory in the quasi-war with France. The First Barbary War, the War of 1812, and the Second Barbary War. The Navy's earliest years were far from easy, but far more successful than they may have appeared. The Continental Navy, supported by privateers, not only disrupted British reinforcements, but also shook the foundations of Britain's trade-dependent economy. From the beginning, it was clear sea power was essential to securing our independence. Perhaps most important, American officers and sailors demonstrated extraordinary valor, even in the face of overwhelming odds, a characteristic that would permeate the U.S. Navy even into the darkest days of World War II and to today. Alfred Thayer Mahan once wrote, "Whoever rules the waves rules the world." An adage is true today as it was throughout the history of our great country. It has also confirmed a belief I personally espouse, that to be a superpower, you must be a sea power. As Secretary of the Navy, I'm profoundly grateful to every individual who has served and to every sailor and Marine who has stood the watch, past and present, in defense of our Republic. Let us honor the legacy of those who came before us. Let us reflect on the enduring spirit that began in 1775, because that spirit, one forged in honor, courage, and commitment, remains in all of us today. Thank you for joining me today to celebrate our shared heritage. May God bless you, the Navy Marine Corps team, and the United States of America.
U.S. Army Major Scott Smiley paid a high price serving our nation. Scott was leading his platoon in Iraq when a blast sent shrapnel through his eyes, leaving him blind and temporarily paralyzed. Scott would become the first blind active duty military officer before medically retiring years later. Thanks to friends like you, the Tunnel to Towers Foundation gave Scott and his family a mortgage-free, specially adapted smart home. Show your support for America's heroes now. Donate $11 a month to Tunnel to Towers at T2T.org.
We the people, in order to form a more perfect union.
Just over 231,000 men served in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and only 48,000 ever served at the same time. How many can you name? George Washington probably comes to mind. Maybe Hamilton, Lafayette. If you're a real history buff, you might remember Nathaniel Greene or John Stark. How about all the others? Who remembers the ordinary soldiers who won our independence? I'm Michael Knowles, and I remember one of those soldiers. Not because he led a famous regiment or went on to hold any high office. There's no monument to his service other than a small headstone in a far-flung cemetery with a simple four-word epitaph: Soldier of the Revolution. And I remember that soldier because he's my great-great-great-great-grandpa, Simon Knowles. Like most Continental soldiers, Simon's name appears in the appendix of a history book. If not for a single Army pension application, written almost 50 years after the fact, no one would know a thing about his service. But Providence and Congress so arranged things that we do know about his service, and the service of tens of thousands of his fellow rank-and-file soldiers. Simon signed up to fight at the tender age of 15, and he served throughout the entire war. From the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, across the Delaware with Washington to the battles of Trenton, Princeton, and Saratoga. Through the bitter winter at Valley Forge, all the way through final victory at Yorktown, and then to an honorable discharge once again with Washington at Newburgh in 1783. After the war, Simon, like most of his fellow veterans, became a farmer. He didn't own much. His estate comprised a heifer, a sword from his father, and a walking cane. Personal effects, all of the value of $1. This relative poverty, common among the men who won the Revolution, was a hardship for him, but a blessing to us, because it prompted these patriots to detail their service in official government documents in exchange for a modest stipend in their old age. But money was never a top priority for these men. The teenagers and 20-somethings who enlisted and re-enlisted in the Continental Army might have done so with the promise of pay, but that pay rarely came on time. Even when it did, it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. A wagon load of Continental dollars would hardly buy a wagon load of provisions. The men were paid as though they were volunteers, but they were expected to fight like a professional army. General Stark trained his men in the finer points of warfare, including the bayonet, which astonished the Hessians in the surprise attack at Trenton. Hessian survivors recounted that the American troops charged with a ferocity and discipline more characteristic of elite European forces than of a ragtag New World militia. These ordinary soldiers' skill in battle was all the more impressive, given the fact that they were usually starving. At Valley Forge, during the winter of 1777 to 1778, meat and bread all but disappeared. The men lived on fire cakes, flour and water paste, for days on end. The most common refrain from the feeble huts that lined the camp was, "No meat." Joseph Plum Martin was 17 years old when he encamped at Valley Forge. Oftentimes, he wrote, "Have I gone 1, 2, 3, even 4 days without a morsel, unless the fields or forests might chance to afford enough to prevent absolute starvation. Often, when I have picked the last grain from the bones of my scanty morsel, have I eat the very bones, as much of them as possibly could be eaten, and then have had to perform some hard and fatiguing duty." 1 in 6 soldiers died that winter. Those who survived the bullets and bayonets of the British, as well as the constant malnutrition, disease, dysentery, typhus, smallpox, and exposure. General Washington reported that by late December of that year, not less than 2,898 men were unfit for duty by reason of their being barefoot and otherwise naked. Many couldn't walk on their frost-bitten feet. And Valley Forge wasn't even the coldest winter. 2 years later, during the winter of 1779 to 1780,
one sentry froze to death at his post in Morristown, New Jersey. When the Continental soldiers weren't freezing, they were dropping from heat stroke. At the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, countless soldiers collapsed, and dozens died from heat exhaustion. One sergeant recalled that the sun-baked soldiers drank from mud puddles as they ducked British cannonballs. But the endless suffering was only one part of the story, and the minor part at that. The crucial fact of that battle, of the whole revolution really, was that the Americans stood their ground. Before the British slunk away, the Patriots had proved that they could face the finest army on earth in open battle, despite an incomparable disadvantage in training and supplies. Unfortunately, the morale boost did not improve material conditions on the ground. When soldiers ran out of food in Maine during Colonel Arnold's expedition to Quebec, they boiled leather for soup. After 7 days, with no kind of nourishment but roots and black birch bark, Private William Beggs recalled, his party of soldiers ate a stray horse, and they were lucky to have found it. On the Sullivan Campaign in 1779, soldiers had to settle for horse feed, as overstretched supply lines reduced them to half rations without flour. And still, they managed to rout Tory Rangers and their Iroquois allies at the Battle of Newtown, a major military victory, albeit one that cost them their clothes. One private, Nathan Davis, recalled that his uniform had been cut to rags by marching through woods and thickets. Many men walked bare-chested. The lucky ones wore Indian leggings. Some wore little more than loincloths, but they had broken the Indian strength and advanced the Army's campaign. Occasionally, troops mutinied. Who could blame them? But most did not. In Simon's New Hampshire line, no major mutiny ever broke out. These men had not signed up for good food, warm clothes, or pity parties, but they enlisted with a purpose: to defend their country. And the defense of one's country entails sacrifice. Modern people sometimes struggle to believe that others are not as cynical as they themselves. They believe that all human action must derive from selfish, material interest. The ordinary soldiers who signed up to fight for American independence confound these cynics, because they didn't stand to gain much of anything, at least materially, for their troubles. What motivated them was more valuable: honor, virtue, ideals. Ensign Samuel Cooper wrote to his wife in July 1775, "The dangers we are to encounter I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, your father was a coward." These soldiers took leave of their families, some of whom disagreed even with the cause of independence. They endured and overcame their hardships for, in the words of Massachusetts soldier James Davenport, liberty, peace, and independence forever. If the soldiers had one fear, it was the indifference of their countrymen, that their sacrifices would be in vain, and their cause soon forgotten. At Valley Forge, Dr. Albigence Waldo described the dread in his diary. "There comes a soldier. He comes and cries, 'I fail fast, I shall soon be no more, and all the reward I shall get will be, poor Will is dead.'" In 1780, the Continental Congress voted to give a reward, at least to officers who had served in the Revolution. Half pay for life, a courtesy later amended to full pay for 5 years. The ordinary soldier, on the other hand, returned home with next to nothing: worthless promissory notes and a pat on the back. It took an additional 38 years, and for most soldiers more than half a century, for Congress finally to offer a reward to the destitute veterans who had not already died. Even in their old age and penury, these veterans once again gave their country a greater gift than anything they received in return. They told us who they were and what they did, and not one of their names was ordinary. No man is ordinary. Each man suffers and delights, fails and triumphs in his own way. Or, in the words of the poet of the Revolution, Philip Freneau, "Far, far from domes where splendid tapers glare, 'tis his from dear-bought peace no wealth to win. Removed alike from courtly cringing squires, the great man's levy and the proud man's grin. Sold are those arms which once on Britons blazed, when, flushed with conquest, to the charge they came. That power repelled, and freedom's fabric raised, she leaves her soldier, famine, and a name."
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
Today, America celebrates 250 years of one of the most legendary military forces in the history of the world, the United States Marine Corps. On November 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution to raise 2 battalions of Continental Marines. These first Marines fought for our independence on land and at sea, taking on the mightiest naval force in the history of the world, from the coast of Maine to the islands of the Bahamas to England itself. Since then, the Marines have fought hand-to-hand at Belleau Wood, stormed the beaches of Tarawa, and prevailed over foes in Fallujah and across Afghanistan. The Marine Corps has always been the tip of the spear of America's military dominance, the first to fight. Now, that reputation helped inform my own decision to enlist in 2003. And as former Commandant General Chuck Krulak said, the Marine Corps does 2 great things for our country. It wins battles, and it makes Marines. Now, as with countless other young men and women who served, my time in the Marines taught me the value of discipline, responsibility, resilience, and duty. More than anything, I'm grateful to the Marine Corps for the lessons it instilled in me about sacrifice and for the lifelong friends I made. On this 250th birthday of the Corps, we commemorate its history by honoring every Marine who stood the watch and by solemnly remembering those who gave their last full measure of devotion. We also commit to the future. America will endure because her Marines will never fail her. Semper Fidelis, Marines. Happy birthday.
To each other, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor.
When I was a kid, people often spoke of the American dream. It was usually described in terms of the hope that honest middle-class families could own a home, care for their loved ones, and leave their children better off than themselves. Many of my friends' parents had lived through the Great Depression, and some fought in World War II. They knew privation, grief, and sacrifice. It shouldn't surprise us that their understanding of the American dream was largely rooted in a sense of material security. And yet, I would suggest that this desire for economic security was undergirded by something more profound: the aspiration for spiritual freedom, the freedom to live in accord with one's conscience and to follow the teaching of one's religious beliefs. This reverence for Americans' religious convictions formed the bedrock of our country from the beginning. Some might say this notion of spiritual freedom belongs to the private sphere. It is a matter of personal practice and not of public affairs. Some might even argue that to debase matters of religion to those of politics is to muddy the waters of public discourse with pious sentiments. One of the most prominent voices of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, a deist and one of the founders most influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers, Jefferson nevertheless wrote just 5 years after drafting the Declaration, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we remove their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God?" And to that question, Jefferson and his fellow founders would have said no. Rights, as understood by the drafters of the Declaration and the Constitution, are not conjured into existence by political consensus, nor are they granted by parliaments or princes. Our rights exist not on parchment alone, but on the immutable foundation of the laws of nature and nature's God. That is to say that even if the drafters of the Constitution disregarded a fundamental right to life, the American people, just like every people across history, can claim a share of that right, or that gift, as Jefferson recognized, because of the basic fact that life comes not from the government, but from God. This is the animating principle behind what the founders called natural rights. Rights inherent to the human person, not because of race or wealth or nationality, but because of the dignity bestowed by the Creator. As Alexander Hamilton put it 1 year before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. In our day, I fear that we are at risk of losing this metaphysical grounding of a person's rights. There seems to be no limit to the number or kinds of rights individuals can claim. Rights have become assertions of will, often severed from truth or justice. Sadly, deeply immoral acts are often defended under the banner of individual rights. But I would posit to you that this conception of rights is really a misconception. Rights do not exist just because we say they do. And here I call to mind one of my intellectual heroes, St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas rarely spoke of rights in the plural. Instead, he referred to the Latin word jus, which means the right, understood not as a claim, but as that which is due to another. In Thomistic terms, a right is what justice demands, as measured by the divine order. By this he meant something in accord with God's design for mankind and the universe. This is a far more substantive and sobering understanding of rights. It places rights not in the realm of popular preference or ever-evolving societal demands, but in the realm of respect for the human person, and the common good. At the same time, the natural law tradition insists that these principles of freedom, justice, rights, and responsibilities are not hidden from us. On the contrary, these fundamental truths are accessible to all, discoverable by natural reason, written, as St. Paul says, in their hearts. This is precisely the claim made in the opening of the Declaration of Independence, that the American cause is justified not by majority will nor sectarian creed, but by the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Importantly, the Declaration's appeal to the British is not a democratic one. The colonists did not declare political independence from their ancestral homeland simply because the majority agreed. No, the appeal of the Declaration was fundamentally moral and philosophical. It was a practical application of moral reason to political grievance. In the estimation of the signers of the Declaration, British governance had devolved from stewardship into tyranny. In fact, they all agreed in the Declaration that the Crown involved itself in circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. This claim is not for mere rhetorical flourish. Rather, it signals a moral judgment. The abuses of the Crown were more than an inconvenience. They were a grave injustice. The signers of the Declaration committed a revolutionary act, one that led to a devastating war. Yet they acted to restore the moral law that had been lost, the rights that we are given by God. And while it's impossible for us to know the thoughts within the hearts and minds of men, I believe it was the conscience, the inner witness of the divine law that stirred many of the founders to affix their names to the Declaration. Conscience is the key to understanding how the founders accessed the truths of the eternal law and applied them to their circumstances. The Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes describes conscience as the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. There he's alone with God, whose voice echoes in its depths. The founders' defense of the colonists was not only an act of courage, but one of justice. Prior to America's founding, many nations only recognized the rights of a privileged few. But the Declaration laid the foundation for recognizing the rights of all Americans. Now, this promise of liberty was not fulfilled instantaneously. It took a bloody civil war and many courageous abolitionists to end the sin of slavery and respect the dignity of all persons. But from the very beginning, our founders understood that rights do not exist within a vacuum. With every right comes responsibilities to our families, our fellow citizens, and our Creator. In other words, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness does not render the political order neutral on questions of good and evil. It does not leave us in a naked public square, to use Father Richard John Newhouse's famous phrase. Rather, it presumes that citizens are moral actors, capable of discerning the good and obligated to pursue it. The Founding Fathers anticipated that the American people would not passively receive dictates from the state as distant subjects, but that they would actively participate in moral and political deliberations as citizens. This is why George Washington famously said in his farewell address, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens." Today, nearly 250 years after the birth of our republic, we find ourselves the recipients of this great moral inheritance. For if our rights are real, then so too are our responsibilities. To be an American citizen is to be entrusted with the freedom to pursue the good, the duty to care for our neighbors and uphold justice, and the burden and the privilege of conscience. May we prove worthy of it.
It's our purpose to bring to bear the principle of common sense and rational discussion to the issues of our day. America was created at a time of great turmoil, tremendous disagreements, anger, hatred. There was a book written in 1776 that guided much of the discipline of thinking that brought to us the discovery of our freedoms, of our God-given freedoms. It was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in 1776, one of the first American bestsellers, in which Thomas Paine explained, by rational principles, the reason why these small colonies felt the necessity to separate from the Kingdom of Great Britain and the King of England. He explained their inherent desire for liberty, for freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the ability to select the people who govern them. And he explained it in ways that were understandable to all the people, not just the elite. Because the desire for freedom is universal. The desire for freedom adheres in the human mind, and it is part of the human soul. This is exactly the time we should consult our history. Look at what we've done in the past and see if we can't use it to help us now. We understand that our founders created the greatest country in the history of the world, the greatest democracy, the freest country, a country that has taken more people out of poverty than any country ever. All of us are so fortunate to be Americans. But a great deal of the reason for America's constant ability to self-improve is because we're able to reason, we're able to talk, we're able to analyze. We are able to apply our God